Um, it's been a tough year all around for everyone. So we wanted to have this webinar to talk about both economics and wine, and also to get together with the community and have a little fun. So we really hope that it can be that, and we'll proceed from here. I'm Paul Crooker, and a member of the board. Of the San Francisco Booth Alumni Club. And we're delighted to have Professor Mike Gibbs as our featured speaker tonight, discussing the economics of the wine industry, expert ratings, pricing, and globalization. The presentation will last approximately 1 hour with 45 minutes of formal presentation and 15 minutes of Q&A, but those are kind of rough targets but estimates. And hold on a second, my computer's playing a little funny here. Thank you all for submitting questions, when you registered. So we'll be focused on those and handling those. And I just want to go through Professor Gibbs's biography. Most of you know Michael Gibbs, but for those of you that don't, he studies the economics of human resources and organizational design. He is the co-author of a leading textbook in the field, Personnel Economics in Practice, which has been translated into Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Bulgarian, and Spanish. Mike's research has been published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Review of Economics and Statistics, Industrial Labor Relations Review, Accounting Review, and other journals. Professor Gibbs is a research fellow of the Center for the Study of Labor and the Institute for Compensation Studies. From 2012 to 2015, he was a faculty director of Booth's executive MBA program. So many of us are familiar with that program and went through it. In 2007, Mike received the notable contribution to management accounting literature from the American Accounting Association, and he has received 3 Hillel Einhorn Excellence in Teaching Awards. So here's, and the final part is Mike earned all his degrees in AB and an AM and a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. And for those of us who know Mike, and those of you who will get to know him going through the programs, we know he bleeds maroon. So that's a good one. And what else do we have to say here? If the final thing is we want to make this interactive, and if you hang around to the end, we're going to be stopping the recording and allowing everybody audio visual. So with that, Mike, you go ahead with your presentation on wine economics.
Thanks, Paul. I'm grateful to you for organizing this, and thanks Leanne in the background, who none of you can see, who's helping us run this. And Paul, it's real great to see you again. We still have to make up that one last problem set, I think, for Michael or something. I don't know. Anyway, and everyone else, it is a real pleasure to be with you tonight. I can't see you yet, of course, which is a little strange. When Paul approached me about doing some kind of event, we thought this would be a nice event to do and a nice week to do it. Friday night of election week, regardless of who you were voting for or rooting for in the election. We thought it'd be nice to do something that's kind of informal, relaxed, fun. It's research oriented, but it's low key. And so I've actually done a little bit of research published in the Journal of Wine Economics. That's what we're going to talk about. I have a glass of Priorat from Spain, from near Barcelona, where we used to have our EXP campus. And I hope you have all brought whatever your favorite beverage of choice is. On this Friday night, we've all earned a break. I think, Paul, I don't remember if you mentioned, but the plan here is we're going to go roughly something like an hour with a formal part of the session. But once we've done that, Leanne will be able to stop the recording, and anybody who wants to just hang out after that for the full 90 minutes, I'll be staying on, Paul will be staying on. Leanne will make all of you panelists as well, which means that we can all see each other's pictures and just interact with each other. So I don't expect people to stay the full 90 minutes if they don't want to, but I'll be here, and there will be opportunity to just chat informally and see each other at that point. All right, then, with no further ado, I'm going to take a sip of my wine. Here's to all of you. And to getting through this year and this week and everything else together. By the way, just one other quick note. I am sitting in my classroom. This is our guest bedroom at home. I decided not to use a backdrop so you can see it exactly as my students see it. I'm teaching from home this quarter. My wife's also a professor at the University of Chicago, also an economist. What else is there? And we're both teaching by Zoom, and she'll be doing that next quarter as well, unfortunately. So I teach microeconomics exactly from this setup. It's not ideal, but we're making it work as best we can. Hopefully we won't be doing it by spring or summer. All right. Okay, so where did this research come from? Why am I doing research on wine in the first place? I know almost nothing about wine, but I had some friends who are economists in Denmark and France who are interested in gastronomy and wine because they're Europeans and they were economists, so they started collecting data and doing research on the economics of gastronomy and wine. They formed the Association of Food Economists. That evolved quickly into the Association of Wine Economists. And this became a topic which a lot of economists were interested in. And so a group internationally of economists interested in wine grew up out of that. And they founded a journal called the Journal of Wine Economics, which publishes about 4 issues per year and publishes very high quality research, I have to say. I've been amazed at the quality of the research. There's sort of three areas I think that economists like to study just for fun. One is their sports economics. Another is some game theorists like to collect data from TV game shows and write papers about game shows. And the other seems to be wine, But the quality of the research published in the Journal of Wine Economics is quite good. And if you are interested in wine, a sophisticated wine person, this is Northern California in theory that's hosting this. I see Michael Case has a bottle of Cabernet from Napa in front of him right now. Then you might be interested in taking a look at the Journal of Wine Economics. You can look on their website. Very high quality research. And since I'm friends with these guys, when they founded the journal, they asked me to join their editorial advisory board. Dick Taylor is also a member of their editorial advisory board. I've never done any editing or advising, but I am affiliated with them. And at one point, I wrote a paper with one of them, with actually two economists. And that's what I'll be talking about right now. And at the end, if you remind me, I'll talk about what the next project is that we hope to do. Okay, so I wonder who the alum is who's in our group who graduated the longest time ago. I was college class of 84. And I got my PhD in 89 and master's in the middle of all that. I wonder if there's anyone who was around campus back in the 1980s. If so, they might remember George Stigler. George Stigler was the first Nobel that Booth takes credit for, although he was certainly not the first economics Nobel at the University of Chicago. Very famous economist. I took a class with him in the 1980s. And he's famous for the economics of regulation and other things like that. But what he actually won his Nobel Prize for, what the committee cited, I see Amit's here from GSB 83, so you probably heard Stigler or maybe took a class from it. So what he was actually received the Nobel Prize for was a paper in 1961 on the economics of information, first pointing out that information has very important effects on how markets function, and that economists at the time hadn't thought about them. And he proposed a whole bunch of ideas about how we might start bringing information into our analyses, including that information is itself a good and so forth. This paper is kind of in that spirit. If you remember your microeconomics class, and for those of you who took mine, you better remember it. There's a quiz at the end today. We sometimes talk about three types of goods when we're thinking about uncertainty about the quality of those goods. And this is the kind of an issue that Stigler raised long ago. One type of good we call search good. These are goods for which you can assess the quality before you purchase the good, but you have to go out and search and learn the characteristics. You go to an auto dealership, you test drive the car, you go to a clothing store, you feel the fabric and so forth. Then there's another kind of good for which it's difficult or impossible to assess the quality and characteristics of the good before you buy it. And this is called an experience good. Classic example of this would be a perfume. It's the kind of thing where you can ask someone, what's the perfume like? But you really can't get anything out of that unless you actually smell the fragrance yourself. And then there's a third category, sort of a subcategory, if you will, of experience goods. And this is called credence goods. And these are goods for which you can't even assess the quality after purchasing and after consuming sometimes. There aren't many goods like this, but there are some. So think about auto repair, or one that might be particularly appropriate for 2020 COVID and election and everything. Psychotherapy. You might get psychotherapy and you might think you got something good out of it, but you're not really quite sure. You might think about wine as well. For me, since I don't have a great palate, this is a really nice bottle of Spanish wine I've been saving for a special occasion for a long time, but I don't really know if it's great or not because I'm not a wine expert. So wine might be a credence good, but it is definitely at least an experience good. And among the homework I gave you were two articles on that theme. One is on wine bullshit. There, I said that word on the recording, Leanne. And the other is a paper by Roman Leal, who was an accounting professor that some of you probably took a class from. And that was published in the Journal of Wine Economics. And Roman used to do blind wine tastings with his students in some of his classes, and he collected the data. And he concluded that experts are no better at telling whether a wine is good or not than non-experts. Now, I don't think that paper is actually correct because he didn't have a random sample, and there have been other studies which are more carefully designed, but I put it in there for fun. I think there is evidence that those who become experts at wine become better at evaluating the quality of a wine than novices like me. But in any case, so uncertainty about quality is going to matter a lot in some markets, especially for experience goods and credence goods, and certainly for fine wine. And what we wanted to think about was, what's the effect of globalization? Globalization is bringing in more what I will call naive consumers. People like me who didn't grow up in Europe, don't have experience of wine, maybe don't have a good palate and so forth and so on. And with globalization, at the time we wrote the paper, we're seeing much more demand for fine wine coming out of China, India, Brazil, Russia, and emerging markets and so forth. And we thought, well, there probably is going to be some important effects on the wine industry because of this. And in particular, many consumers from new markets don't have the knowledge and experience to assess the quality of wines that Europeans or Californians may have. And that was the basis for thinking about this. And the other basis for this paper was my friends, Miguel Tapia and Frederick Wierzinski, my co-authors, spent some time collecting data from Robert Parker's wine website, erobertparker.com. They literally logged on and did screenshots and transcribed the data. This was in the days before web crawlers and all this stuff. So we had some data on Robert Parker's organization's ratings of wines, fine wines, and pricing. Over time, we thought maybe we could come up with something fun to work on. Okay. All right, so if we're thinking about the effect of globalization in this context, what effect is that going to have on the wine market? And of course, the first thing that we all are going to do then is start thinking about supply and demand, right? And that's exactly what we did. So in the paper, which you should have gotten a copy of, we actually wrote down a very simple model of supply and demand, a few equations to try to express the kind of ideas I'm going to be talking about. So in this picture, we have three demand curves. We have a demand curve for fine wine by sophisticated consumers who know something about the quality of the wine. They're well informed. We have a demand curve for naive consumers. They have less quality, lower quality of information about the quality of the wine. They're less well informed. And then total demand would be the horizontal sum of those at any price. We would just sum the quantities, and we get a total demand curve. And I'm just throwing it out here to try to make it sound like a classroom just for fun, the term horizontal demand, okay? And so we model demand as a function of the utility that people get from consuming wine, which depends on their taste for wine. We might think that sophisticated consumers have more refined taste than naive consumers, for example. their estimate of the quality of the wine, because there's always uncertainty. Even if you know a lot about a wine, every bottle is going to be different. Sometimes they're going to be corked. Sometimes they're going to have that magic essence. You just don't know. And then people are risk averse. So the fact that there's uncertainty about the quality of the wine they're going to purchase is going to lower their demand for the product. Now, by the way, I'm a student of Gary Becker's, and Gary Becker's approach was always to try and explain behavior, not by ad hoc assumptions about people's psychology, but about economic factors. And in that spirit, we did not assume that sophisticated users have a more refined taste for fine wine. We started with the assumption that naive and sophisticated consumers are exactly the same in their psychology, their preferences, but that the only thing that's different is that sophisticated consumers have better information than naive consumers. And I don't think that's quite correct, but it's the right starting place. You could write down a fancier model with added complication where there's habit formation and people develop refined palates over time. Okay. All right, and then there's uncertain product quality. So again, we're assuming that people have the same tastes, but they have different assessments of quality. And the way to formalize that is the uncertainty that I have about buying a bottle of wine depends on the extent to which I'm a sophisticated user or an unsophisticated user. And if we define that, if we measure that as the variance in quality of a bottle of wine, naive users have higher variance in buying a bottle of wine because of their lack of information. Right? Bet you didn't expect some equations, did you? Okay, and then we ask, okay, what happens if new information is brought into this market? And in particular, we're thinking there's a rating about wine, but this could be any good for which ratings are important, and the goods are experience goods or credence goods. But in this case, imagine that Robert Parker or one of his colleagues rates a bottle of wine. Now we have some information. It's information from someone who is an expert. How is that going to affect the market? We work this out in our simple little model. All we need to do is assume that the person rating the wine is more informed than either sophisticated users or naive users. And I think that's a reasonable assumption. Why would they be deemed experts, and why would they be oh no, I'm not sharing my slides, Paul. Apologies, everyone. We forgot to share the slides. You can see them now? I actually had a slight demand curve here for you. Okay, anyway, I will continue from this point. Thank you guys for pointing that out. Okay. All right, so we have two types of users, naive and sophisticated. We have a new piece of information that pops into the market. An expert, Paul Crooker, rates wine, and he's world-renowned as an expert in wine. Because he's an expert, the quality of his information means that the variance of his assessment of the quality of a bottle of wine is lower than the rest than other consumers. When consumers see that rating, they'll do Bayesian updating of their opinion or their estimate of the quality of the wine. And this is very, very standard Bayesian updating. Since we have new information that is more precise, has lower variance, they will both update their assessments and their posterior assessments with the new information will also have lower variance. They will have better quality information. And then what are the effects of this rating on the price of a bottle of wine? There's a couple of things that we concluded. The first is with new information, when a wine is rated, the price of the wine should increase because now it's less of a risky good. Risk-averse consumers are more willing to pay for something we have better information about. Second, the price could rise or fall depending on whether the review is a surprise. So compared to their previous estimate that people had about the bottle of wine, if the rater disagrees with them, that will raise or lower your opinion. Third, the price should change more if there are more naive consumers in the market, because naive consumers are going to learn more from new information than sophisticated consumers are, and they're going to change their demand more. Okay, and this is where we start thinking about the effects of globalization and the value of having experts in the market where quality starts to assess. Right? And then finally, we can look at the cases where a bottle of wine has a second rating, maybe 2 years later or something like that. And when there's a second rating, we see similar effects, but the effect of the second rating is going to be smaller because it's only incremental information after the first rating. All right. Any questions at that point? Just type them into the chat room. I'm sorry, I forgot to share my slides. You know, normally I have a teaching assistant when I'm teaching micro by Zoom, and he or she is always telling me to do these things. Okay, and then we can ask, what's the effect of globalization on these ideas? First of all, as globalization increases the demand for wine, as it pushes out the demand, especially by naive consumers, but that pushes out total demand, we would expect that the price would rise. Although we have to be a little careful because as there's more demand, the wine industry is going to increase its supply over time too. And that certainly happens. But one thing that's interesting about fine wines is they are usually tied to a specific regions, particularly in Europe and California. There are appellations, villages, and there's very limited space, acreage, which is allowed to produce, say, a Bordeaux wine or a Champagne or something like that, which means that the supply of wine is going to be relatively inelastic, at least for a specific bottle. You know, and over time, you'll see Chile and Argentina and New Zealand and Australia entering the market, and supply will increase, but those won't be perfect substitutes for famous high quality wines, and they'll take time. So with inelastic supply, we should certainly expect the price to rise, although it's a little ambiguous because as naive consumers enter the market, they have less, lower quality of information, and they're willing to pay less for the same bottle of wine compared to a sophisticated buyer, just because of risk aversion. Okay. But then this is the thing I think is more interesting. This is the kind of thing that you would get in a marketing class, frankly. I said on the previous slide that with a new rating of wine by an expert, the price will rise. I also said that this is going to be a stronger effect if there are more naive consumers. So what we should see is that the effect of a rating on pricing of wine, the sensitivity, if you will, of the price of the wine to the rating should increase with globalization because there are more consumers who benefit from that rating. And this effect in our model should be most important for the highest quality products, the high-end wines, and not so much for the low-end wines. And then finally, an implication of that is, and this goes back to Stigler, information is now a good in itself. It has a value in making this market function better. And the value of experts, the value of the wine spectator, the wine advocate, these wine magazines and wine rating websites and so forth, just grows with globalization, becomes more important. And again, keep in mind that these ideas are true for all sorts of markets, not just fine wine. All right, so here's the data we have. These data are a little out of date now, unfortunately. We're going to go back and collect new data. In fact, we're doing it right now, but I'll talk about it at the end. So we have about 30 years of Robert Parker data, and since my friends literally just pulled the data off the website by hand, they had limited capacity to do so. So we have Parker ratings of these wines for about 6 years, no, 14 years. And we have an estimate of the price in the US for these bottles of wine that's also provided by erobertparker.com. And then we have two other measures that we created. One we call reputation. This is to measure the average ratings of wines from this vineyard up to that point in time. So if this is Vega Sicilia, Spain's most famous vineyard, for which I will never be able to afford a bottle of their top wine, we would measure reputation by the ratings of prior wines and apply that reputation measure to their current wine. And then the age of the wine is just the year of the rating minus the year of the vintage. So it gives us some idea of how long the wine has been cellared, which is important for many fine wines. And then my friends focused on a couple of regions due to their limited time: Bordeaux, certain areas of Spain, and fortunately for our audience, certain parts of California as well, where the best wines are produced, of course, right? It is weird speaking to an audience where I can't see your faces. With my students, I can see the faces. All right. Here's just a plot of the distribution of Parker points. You know, those little cards you see at the wine store. If you've ever wondered what they will look like, the horizontal axis shows you some wines get rated as low as something like 70 or 71. Not sure I want to try one of those. The rarefied wines are the ones in the 90s and above, and we see that those are very, very rare. And then this is the average price, also plotted as a function. And you can see it's nonlinear and convex with respect to Parker point. Never tried a 100 point wine. I have one or two in the basement though, because I found them on sale, but I put them away for a special occasion, maybe someday. All right. And then just for fun, here's what we did. We took these data and we ran regressions. Regressions predicting price, actually predicting the logarithm of price, because as you can see, price is non-linearly related to the variables that we have. So when you're regressing the log of price on variables, then the coefficient is going to give you an estimate of the effect of the variable on the percentage change in the price, which is easy to interpret, but that's a statistical detail. So we're running regressions trying to predict wine prices as a function of the region, the type of wine, the vintage, but also the Parker ratings. So what that gives us is a prediction of what the wine should cost given all of its characteristics. And with regressions, you end up with residuals. There's a positive residual if the price is higher than what is predicted by the model. There's a negative residual if it's what is predicted, if the price is below what is predicted by the model. And here we see the price premia, the average residual for various types of wines in various regions, okay? And also how those change over time. So you see that Rioja wines tend to be cheaper and Spanish wines tend to be cheaper than California wines, and California wines tend to be cheaper than French wines, controlling for Robert Parker ratings and so forth and so on. Okay, so Yuri, at the time, for the data we were looking at, yeah, I think Spanish wine was undervalued. Again, this study was about 10 years ago, and I'm not sure that's true now. I suspect there's some truth to it, but I think more people now understand the quality of Spanish wine, and maybe that's less true than it used to be. But I think most of us would be comfortable in saying that French wine is probably still overpriced in some sense. And just for fun, here's the specific bottles that were most overpriced and underpriced in our data set. Ironically, a Spanish wine being the most overpriced with a rating of 85. It seems like some kind of outlier. Interesting, most of them were from Pomerol in France. Couple from California. I've never tried Cinquantel on your toes. Okay. The True is famous. And here are the most underpriced. So Yuri, to your question, we see Rioja, Duero, Rioja, Ribera del Duero, Rioja. There's a bunch of Spanish ones in there. So I think Spanish wines were underpriced. And that's one reason why I picked a Spanish wine for myself tonight. Okay. So I guess I'll mention now, we've gotten an agreement with the Robert Parker Group where they're going to give us access to all of their rating data and all of their pricing data, not just for these specific regions. So we're going to be able to update this study with data that's current, and it's going to be much more comprehensive. It should have, for example, Australian wines and more Californian wines, Italian wines, and Greek wines, and so forth. And that's very cool. And the other thing we're doing is they put us in touch with a company called winesearcher.com. Many of you are familiar with winesearcher.com. If you Google a specific wine like Vega Sicilian Unico, Google will always put Wine Searcher right up at the top as the first site to click on. In Wine Searcher, their business is to web crawl 24 hours a day all around the globe, looking for listings of wine prices at stores in every country they can find and pulling those data. And they're going to provide us access to this data. So what we're hoping to do is get pricing data, not just for the US, but for some other major markets, such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, Europe as well. And then we'll be able to look maybe at some of these questions of globalization as well. But the other thing that'd be really fun, and I won't be able to just talk about in public, is we will be able to come up with an estimate of what the price of the bottle of wine should be and compare that to what the market price is, and maybe look for some opportunities to buy a nice bottle of wine. So we'll see. Yes, these are just Robert Parker scores for the last question here. Okay, now to a little bit of formal statistical analysis. So you will, of course, immediately remember the concept of elasticity of demand, right? It's a measure of how sensitive your customers are to your price that you charge them. Elasticities are always the percentage change in one variable given a percentage change in another variable. So elasticity of demand is traditionally percentage change in the quantity sold given a percentage change in price. So I'm not calculating that, but I'm calculating kind of the inverse of that here. We're running regressions on log of price as a function of log of points for that specific type of wine, reputation of the vineyard where that wine was made, and the age of the wine. So those are what the X's are there. And because these are log-log regressions, these coefficients are elasticities. They're the elasticity of price with respect to quality of the wine. So for example, or the age. So for example, if you look at age, this is telling us how long has this wine been cellared. First of all, the coefficient is positive, and this is telling us that for refined wines, the ones we collected, as they mature, they become more valuable on the market. The price goes up. The second thing is that prices of wines definitely depend on the reputation of the vintner, the vineyard. And this is a very significant effect. So a vineyard with high quality reputation is going to be able to charge more for its next bottle of wine, regardless of the quality. But the thing that's really notable here is that the biggest effect isn't the reputation of the vineyard, it is the Robert Parker rating. This is by far the most important effect on the price of wine. And there's a very, very large correlation between the rating, the estimate of quality of the wine by a so-called expert, and the price of the wine in the US at least. And I'm pretty sure we find that in other countries as well. These are pretty good R-squares for this kind of data. We don't have too many variables. Okay? This is basically formalizing that picture I showed you where price rises as a function of points. Okay, so that's kind of a baseline. Reputation matters, log of points matter, but with globalization, we have increasing demand for wine by naive users. And by the way, I don't mean naive to be pejorative in any way. Uninformed might be a better word if you prefer. So how have these effects changed over time? I'll just show you some plots. Some of these details are in the paper that we published. What we see basically is that since about the mid-1990s, the effect of the reputation of the winemaker on the price of wine, these are all inflation adjusted, has risen over time. And this is for all types of wine. And then in this picture, we're breaking out French and California wines separately, although we haven't broken out Spain here. I think we do have enough data for this one. Okay, so this is suggestive of our idea that globalization is going to lead to more value in the market for better quality of information about products because consumers are less informed. More importantly, we can look at Parker ratings, and we see this plot is pretty messy. Things bounce around a fair bit. We didn't have a very deep data set for one thing, and there are other things that are going on. There are business cycle effects and recessions and so forth. But what we see sort of with the very formal eyeball statistical test is there is a trend over time towards more importance of ratings in pricing of the wines over this period of time. And again, this is for all of the three regions that we looked at. And then I think this is a little bit clearer data. In this slide, we see the effect of a change in a Parker rating. So our model predicted that the most important factor is that a wine gets rated in the first place. But it also predicted that if there's a second rating, that should also provide incremental information that should affect the price of wine. When we see a new rating, that's in some sense, I think, a clearer test of the idea that we have information change. That's debatable, I suppose. But what we see here is that even for the second rating, the sensitivity of prices to this new information is rising over time. Now, guys, behave yourselves. You're each showing European bias. Huh? There's a fight breaking out in the chat room here, just like a University of Chicago class. Okay, due to taxes. I don't know who's asking that question, and I don't see the names of most people asking questions in my screen. Sorry, and I'm not sure what you're asking. If you can clarify your question about taxes, I'll try to say something about it. But the data I'm showing you are just prices in the U.S., so taxes will be the same for wines regardless of origin in the U.S. And maybe they're import taxes. Yeah, I don't know. But that shouldn't affect the sensitivity to rating changes, right? So that would be a level effect, but it wouldn't change the partial derivative, that is the regression coefficient with respect to other variables. Okay, and then finally, here's another way of looking at this. Here we're looking at these regression coefficients, which I showed you before. And what basically these are regressions where we've analyzed the data for different time periods and also for different qualities of wine, low, medium, and high quality wine. So these are the really rarefied wines, you know, the 92 point and higher or something like that. These are the 70s and 80s. These are the things that you would, you know, serve to your mother-in-law or whatever, drunk uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner table. And then these are the ones you probably buy and have on a Friday night with your friends or your band de table or whatever. And we see that the coefficients are positive, but what we were interested in were two things in this table. One was, is the effect getting larger over time? This is trying to formalize the pictures that I just showed you. And the second is, are the effects of measures of quality on pricing stronger for high quality wine than for low quality wine, which is what our theory predicted. First of all, you can certainly see that the measures of sensitivity are indeed rising over time, and the differences between these coefficients are statistically significant as well. So there has been a dramatic increase in the importance of expert ratings on wine pricing over this period of time, and I'll bet that's increased since then, although I'll be able to tell you soon. And then the second thing we can look at is has this changed? Well, I guess the second thing we could say is that high quality wines are far more sensitive to quality measures, as you would expect, it won't surprise anyone, than medium and then low. But what we haven't quite seen is that the increase in sensitivity to ratings has increased more for the highest quality wines. It's actually increased more for the medium quality category instead. All right, so for example, an increase from 3.24 to 7.31 over this period of time, that's a bigger proportionate increase than an increase from 7.86 to 11.13, or on the low side from 1.73 to 3.60. And I think what's going on there, this is just speculative, is naive consumers are less likely to buy the highest quality rarefied wines, except for, you know, people who are extremely wealthy. And so the effect is going to be most relevant in the category where they're more likely to consume, and that's probably sort of the sweet spot in the middle. Good quality wines, but not extremely expensive wine. And the other thing, which is outside the scope of our model, but I think is definitely true, is that people develop more refined taste for wine as they consume it more, they experience it more, they learn about the nuances, they learn how to pair it with different foods, they learn how to choose the right wine for the right occasion, and so forth and so on. And so, you know, new consumers from emerging markets, or just new consumers, may be less likely to be interested in the highest quality wine at first, but as their tastes improve, then it might change. I'm just looking at a comment here, apologies. The comment says, more recent Parker ratings may be different. During the data period of the paper, Robert Parker is a long reviewer. No, he wasn't at that point in time either, there were others as well. But yeah, that's one thing we need to do, and I'm glad you reminded me, is try to get the identity of the reviewer from Robert Parker. I think they'll share that with us, that's easy. And then it's a very simple statistical thing we can control for. One way to do it, a common way to do it, is what's called a fixed effect. We basically put in a dummy variable for each evaluator. So there would be a dummy variable for Paul Crooker, couldn't resist Paul, a dummy variable for Michael Case, a dummy variable for Darwin Lee, and a special dummy variable for Uri. And so when they rate wines, we would be able to have, if Paul's a really tough evaluator and Yuri's a very lenient evaluator, the dummy variables will pick up that variation and control for that. And then in some sense, we could get an estimate of how each of them would evaluate the same bottle of wine, if you will. So thank you for reminding me. I need to talk to Parker people about adding that to our data request. So Susan asked, have you been able to parse out whether the increased sensitivity over time might be due to another effect? Unfortunately, no. It would be really nice to pair these. Well, what we need is data on sales in each country, and ideally we need characteristics of the people who buy wine in each country. Getting data on wine sales in each country is impossible because of the way wine is. It's distributed by different distributors in each country, to each country. There's no central data collection point. Even getting pricing would be really difficult, except that there is this thing called Wine Searcher now, which goes out and crawls literally the entire internet trying to pull wine prices. So we're going to get pretty good information on wine prices. The other thing that Wine Searcher has is their business is to do Google searches. You type in the name of a wine, Google puts a link, you click on that link to Wine Searcher, you'll go to Wine Searcher's website, and they'll have a list of stores in your area where you can buy the wine and the price, and they'll have links to them. And then you'll click one, you'll go to that store. Vinny's in Chicago is the biggest wine store. Van Chicago is the best wine store. And when you do that, they're going to make a couple of pennies on that referral. So what they also have data on is about Google searches for each bottle of wine in each country. And that is a measure of interest in the wine. It's not quite demand for the wine, but it's a pretty good measure of demand for the wine. And we can see how that has changed over time too. So we'll be looking at those data as well. All right. Since we're in 2020, I want to take just a minute or two to say a couple of things about how COVID-19 is affecting the fine wine industry. The first thing is that there shouldn't be much effect on supply. Production was already in place. The wineries have been producing their wine. It's a durable good. In fact, for the finest wines, it's stored for a couple of years before the futures are released. So supply isn't really changed that much as long as there's enough space to store the wine that doesn't get distributed. So this is really a question about demand. There's a couple of things to think about. One is we would think that wine sales would fall because restaurants are doing far less business or they're shut during lockdowns and so forth, and people aren't traveling as much. And that is definitely the case. But on the other hand, people are staying at home and, drinking a little wine on a Friday night, perhaps, doing a little self-medication because of the news and the economy and everything else. And that has the opposite effect. So the net effect, at least in Europe, from what I've been able to tell, is that wine consumption has fallen, but only about 8% net of these two effects. But what's definitely the case is that the fine wine market has been most affected. One thing I did is I called up an old friend from, he's a Booth alum from our EXP program in Alexandre Penang. He runs a family champagne house in Verzy in France. His family has had a very small family-run grower champagne business for about 200 or 300 years. And when his father passed away, he took over the business. Here's a picture of one of the labels from his champagne. He makes very, very nice champagne. And I asked him what he saw happening, and he expects there's going to be a lot of industry consolidation because we're going to see bankruptcies and so forth. That, to an economist, that's just rearranging the chairs. The wine industry still exists, the goods are still being produced and will be consumed, but ownership may well change. But consolidation may have important effects on the importance of brand names versus small labels such as Pinay Chardonnay, which is his brand, and so forth. The other thing that's kind of interesting is Bordeaux, famously, the world's most famous and rarefied wine evolved. They had this whole process of wine tastings. Robert Parker's staff and others who travel to Bordeaux, and they go to each of the chateaus and try each of the wines and write it all up. And when they release their evaluations, that's when futures are priced for Bordeaux. But because of COVID, almost none of those tastings could actually take place. They were extremely limited due to restrictions on travel and so forth. And that's a perfect experiment for us, because that means the raters have lower quality information than they normally would. And so that should factor into wine prices and futures prices. And this is supposed to be a pretty good year for wine, for Bordeaux, although some of you probably know more than I do whether it is or not. But the 2009 vintage, which is the one we have information on, these are the changes in futures prices for some of the most famous Bordeaux wines. I know this is very small and you probably can't see this on your screen, but what we're seeing is an average price decrease for futures for Bordeaux between 2018 and 2019 of about 20%. Very, very large effect. Exactly what I would have predicted. Okay. So if you've got some loose change lying around, you might think about this as a year to consider buying some Bordeaux futures. However, when you do so, keep in mind that this is a risky asset because you don't have good quality information about it compared to previous years. Okay, this is my last slide. I'll just say a few things to conclude, and then we can switch into question mode. And as a reminder, once the formal part of this session ends, I'll stay online. Paul will stay online if he can, and we'll switch to a mode where all of us can interact with video and audio as well. For those who want to stay, it's about 8 p.m. on a Friday night in Chicago, and I have a glass of wine, and I have some old friends with me, so I'm certainly looking forward to that. But what we see is the fine wine market is, as you might expect, very sensitive to measures of quality, and ratings are extremely important as measures of quality. Oh, I forgot to mention, with Alexandre Canet, he's been making his wine in Verzy, France for probably about 10 years now, and his family's been making it for much longer than that. But he's trying to modernize it, make it a grower champagne house with high quality, and he's been trying very, very hard to promote sales of it in Paris, in Reims, which is the capital of the Champagne region, in Singapore, where he used to live. It's hard to get outside of those locations, but he also had tried for several years to get the wine evaluated, and eventually he got it rated by Robert Parker's group and some others. His first rating was a 92. Some of his wines have been rated as high as a 96. And this was very, very important to him, and it's for exactly the reason we talked about. When you get a rating of your wine, even if your wine isn't the highest quality, it's going to raise your price because it provides better information, and therefore the product is less risky for buyers. And he's seen that to be the case. Okay, the next thing that we found is that sensitivity to ratings has been increasing over time. We think this is driven in large part by globalization, but we need more data to try and see whether we can get any evidence for that. Notice that the data that we're using is prices in the US, and globalization of wine is not something we're seeing in the US, but the US has to compete for wine against other countries. So if, for example, China is bidding more for Bordeaux wine, that's going to raise the price in the US as well. So our pricing data are just fine anyway. And then pulling back from wine, for all of you who work in markets with experience goods, such as mine, an executive MBA program, which is a high-end luxury good, for which it's at least an experience good and possibly a credence good, globalization should increase the importance of brand names, of expert assessments, of assessments by other consumers, alumni who've gone through a program and so forth and so on. And markets for experts and consultants who can advise people can be extremely important. Maybe there are opportunities here. And this should apply to all kinds of markets, even, I don't know, maybe labor markets. So let me just conclude the formal part by, and then I'll turn to the questions that we have. I want to toast all of you a votre santé, which is French toast, and of course means in 2020 to your health. Paul?
Thanks, Mike. That was great.
I'll share the slides here.
Yeah. I think if anybody didn't get the slides, or you wouldn't have the slides yet, or the papers, let me know and we'll get them out to you. I think the papers were I thought pretty good, considering the the complexity that many of the reviewers and different people put into all these words, and how you correlate the words to the taste. And
yeah, the bullshit article was a lot of fun.
And of course the BS part. So maybe I'll start in this recorded part, just going through some of the questions. I guess I may have failed to mention, but thanks everybody who submitted questions during the registration. Looking at them, I'm not sure Mike has the expertise in all these areas, but you never know. So there was a question on, is there a retail market for top wines, and how efficient is this as opposed to wholesale?
Retail market for, I guess I don't know what that means, because there certainly is. You can go to, fine wine stores all around the Bay Area and buy the world's finest wine, pretty much. I'm not quite sure what the question is there.
All right. There was a question, it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure it's related, but to specifically this talk, but maybe we can think about it as a group. How can the toxins in the soil and the groundwater in Sonoma and Napa counties since the October 2017 Tubbs fire and all the fires since be mitigated? The vines need a detox. How will wine lovers know of potential carcinogens?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think we're all wondering that. And anyone who enjoys California wine is worried about that. I don't have an answer.
Andy says he can, Andy Steinman says he can speak to that question, I think. Okay. Maybe we can unmute him. And
Leanne, is there any way we can unmute Andy?
Yep, just give me a second.
Okay.
Thanks, Andy.
Andy clearly knows more than I do, because he's talking about the history of Parker ratings in his comments, which is...
Yeah, Andy, you should be able to talk. You just need to unmute yourself. I'm actually promoting you to panelist.
There he is.
Go ahead.
Andy, you're on. If you can unmute, we can hear you.
He's muted.
You're muted.
Okay, that should be good.
There you go.
Okay, so I'm a partner in a winery in Oregon and actually do M&A in the wine industry. I have some familiarity on this. There basically is no long-term impact to the soil unless the actual vineyard itself burns, which there has not been very much of in the US. But the impact of having the fires and the smoke does affect that particular vintage, primarily red wines, because the smoke damage gets into the skin of the grape, and red wine making involves contact with the skin. That's where the color comes from. So that's very problematic. But just because you had a problem in a region in 1 year does not necessarily mean there's an ongoing issue.
Yeah, Andy, when I read this question and comment, my mind went to a place about thinking, like, what about the fire retardants? They dropped these fire retardants. I don't know if they were anywhere near the vineyards, but they could certainly, kind of settle out and seep down. Has there been any discussion of that?
Okay, I can't speak to the California part of that this year. I know in past years that the fires have been around the area, not in the area. So it wouldn't be direct impact. And this year, though, I think some vineyards in Napa did burn, and there probably would be fire retardant there, and I just don't know. Like in the case here in Oregon, we had a huge smoke issue this year, and but the fires were actually 30 miles from any vineyard. And it's just a matter of the ground effects and how the smoke got distributed, not the fire itself.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Mike, would this be maybe a good time to stop the recording and promote the rest of the group to audio and visual, like we discussed, Leanne? Can we do
that's great. Everyone stick around. I'm going to promote you all to panelist, in which case then you'll have to share your video and audio in order to participate in the mixer hour. Thank you.
Yeah, and one way to do that is to keep yourself on mute except when you're speaking. That's probably pretty important. When